All right, strap in, everyone. Today we are going deep, deep into a concept that, well, impacts every single one of us.
Yeah.
The state itself.
Yeah. No escaping this one.
We're going to explore what it is, how it works, and why understanding all of this is crucial for you.
Big questions.
Our guide for this deep dive, Murray Rothbard's The Anatomy of the State, a book that really, well, it challenges how we think about government, that's for sure.
Definitely pushes us to really examine some assumptions,
Yeah.
about government and its role in society, how we view it all,
Exactly.
how we've maybe been conditioned to think about it.
Rothbard tackles some really big questions in this work.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking the origins of the state, how it keeps its power, the relationship between states, even his unique perspective on things like taxes. It's a lot.
You might want to grab a notebook. Seriously.
So to kick things off, Rothbard starts by kind of dismantling some common myths we hear about the state.
Okay.
Like the state is this force for good, like a helpful neighbor.
Right.
Or that it's, perfectly reflect what the people want. Like it's a perfect mirror.
The will of the people,
Yeah.
obviously.
And he uses this really thought-provoking question to illustrate this.
Oh, yeah.
If we are the government, like we hear all the time, then how do we explain things like the Holocaust?
Yeah.
Were the Jewish people murdered by the Nazis somehow committing voluntary suicide then?
Whoa. That is a powerful way to challenge that whole "we are the government" idea.
Yes, you think, right?
It makes you realize that just assuming that the state is always good or that it always represents the people can be really, really dangerous.
It really shows that we need to think about what the state actually is, how it really operates.
Okay, so then what is the state, according to Rothbard? What's the definition?
Rothbard defines the state as any entity that successfully claims a monopoly on force, on the use of force within a given territory. It also extracts resources like taxes through coercion, meaning it's not really a voluntary exchange.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like joining a gym where you happily pay your dues.
Not quite. To really understand this better, he makes a distinction between what he calls the economic means, which involves things like, voluntary exchange, production, that kind of stuff. The stuff of the free market, basically.
Okay.
And the political means, which essentially boils down to taking things by force.
So there are two ways to get what you want.
Yeah.
Creating something and trading for it, or just taking it from someone else.
Exactly. And according to Rothbard, the state, well, it operates primarily through that second method, taking, not creating.
Interesting. So if that's how the state functions, how does it come into being in the first place?
Rothbard argues that states don't emerge from some kind of peaceful social contract.
Like we all disagree.
Where everyone agrees to be governed,
Yeah.
Instead, they are born out of, conquest and exploitation.
So not exactly a friendly handshake agreement then.
He uses a pretty vivid analogy to describe this. Imagine a bandit gang taking over a territory.
Right.
And they declare themselves the rulers.
Okay. Yeah.
They might offer some protection in exchange for, say, a cut of your earnings, a cut of your production.
Sure.
But ultimately, their power rests on force.
Are you suggesting that my government is essentially a sophisticated bandit operation?
Well, Rothbard isn't saying that everyone in government is a villain or that they, don't provide any benefits, any good things. But his point is that the state's fundamental mechanism is rooted in force,
Right.
not voluntary cooperation. And that has huge implications for how we understand its actions.
That makes you think twice about where your tax dollars are going. But even if the state, starts out through force, how does it manage to maintain its power over time?
Right.
People don't usually like being coerced.
That's a great question. Rothbard argues that while brute force might work initially, to survive long term, a state needs something more. It needs people to buy into its legitimacy, to believe that it has the right to rule. And that's where things get even more interesting, because this is where intellectuals come into play.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me more about this whole intellectual angle.
Think about it. This state, despite being based on force, needs people to believe in its authority. It needs to create this narrative, a story that justifies its existence, and its actions. And intellectuals often play a key role in crafting that narrative.
So they're like the state's PR team.
Yeah. Crafting a good image for public consumption.
Right.
They provide the theories, historical interpretations, philosophical frameworks that make the state's actions seem not only acceptable, but even beneficial, even necessary.
What's in it for the intellectuals, though? Why go along with this?
It's a two-way street. They get something out of it, too. In return for their support, they often gain prestige, influence within the state apparatus, sometimes even material benefits. Think about court historians or government-funded research, even how certain academic disciplines become intertwined with state interests.
So it's like this symbiotic relationship where the state provides resources, legitimacy, and intellectuals provide these narratives that justify the state's power.
Exactly. And Rothbard, he goes on to detail specific tactics that states use to solidify their power, claiming divine right, instilling fear, like of outside threats, appealing to tradition, promoting nationalism, even manipulating guilt to make people feel indebted to the state.
He even talks about the rise of scientism as a way to justify state control.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like they can take any concept and twist it, to serve their interests.
It is. It's a fascinating insight, but it's also, somewhat unsettling. What's important is that Rothbard's prompting us to think critically about the information we get, especially when it's coming from figures of authority or institutions that, stand to benefit from an expansion of state power. Always ask yourself, who benefits from this narrative?
Right.
And what are their motivations?
It's like he's giving us a toolkit to dissect information, to see through propaganda, which is so valuable.
Absolutely.
Especially today.
Yeah.
When we are bombarded with information from all sides constantly.
This critical lens, it becomes even more crucial as we delve into Rothbard's argument about the state's inherent tendency to expand its power beyond any limits we try to set.
Wait, so even those checks and balances we think we have in place?
Rothbard argues that these often end up becoming tools for the state to legitimize its growth. It's a bit like a chameleon, adapting to the environment. Take constitutionalism, for example. It begins as this noble idea, limiting government power, protecting individual rights.
And then what? What happens?
Let's just say it's open to interpretation. Rothbard points to examples like, how the concept of individual rights can be distorted into arguments for things like the right to a job, which actually ends up increasing government control over the economy, or how utilitarianism, originally all about individual liberty, gets used to justify, all sorts of state interventions in the name of the greater good.
So like the state has this sneaky ability to take our best intentions and twist them to justify more power for itself.
That's one way to put it. And he gives this compelling example from legal scholar Charles Black to illustrate this point. Black analyzes the role of judicial review in the U.S.,
right,
meant to be a safeguard against unconstitutional laws.
Yeah, the Supreme Court is supposed to protect us from government overreach.
That's the idea. But Black argues that in practice, it often ends up having the opposite effect. By constantly ruling on the constitutionality of government actions, the court puts it's like a stamp of approval on the entire system.
Including those actions it might deem unconstitutional.
Right.
So even when the court strikes down a law, it's still reinforcing this idea that the state is the ultimate authority.
Yeah.
Which could make people less likely to even question the state's power as it grows.
Exactly. It's subtle, but it's powerful. And Rothbard, he takes this analysis even further, bringing in the work of John C. Calhoun, who saw this potential flaw in constitutionalism way back in the 19th century.
Oh, wow. What did he say? What did Calhoun have to say about it?
Well, he argued that if you really want to limit government power, you can't rely on the government itself to enforce those limits.
Right. It's like asking a funks to guard the henhouse.
Right. Instead, he proposed this idea of a concurrent majority, where different groups within society would have the power to veto government actions that infringe on their interests.
So instead of checks and balances just between the branches of government, we're talking checks and balances coming from the people themselves.
Yeah. He was specifically focused on states' rights as a check on federal power. But the principle could be applied more broadly. Imagine, if different groups like states, industries, or even communities had the power to block laws they felt were harmful to them.
That would shift the power dynamic.
Yeah. And Rothbard, he finds this concept intriguing, but he argues that Calhoun doesn't go far enough. He questions why we should even stop at groups and instead suggests that individuals should have the power to veto veto state actions, ones that violate their
That's a
rights.
bold idea.
It is. It pushes us to think beyond the traditional definition of the state, But it gets to the heart of Rothbard's belief that true power should reside with individuals, not institutions.
This is pretty mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the power dynamics at play in every aspect of our lives.
It does, and it leads to some of Rothbard's his most provocative conclusions, including his argument that the state is inherently anti-capitalist, which might surprise some people.
Wait, really? Anti-capitalist? How does he get there?
He sees capitalism as a system based on voluntary exchange, private property. And the state, as we've discussed, it operates mainly through coercion and confiscation.
So basically oil and water, they don't mix.
According to Rothbard, that's exactly right. He argues that the state will always be tempted to encroach upon the free market to control it because its very nature is at odds with genuine free exchange.
So it's not just that some governments are more interventionist than others, it's that there's this inherent tension between the state's desire for control and the free market's reliance on individual choice.
Precisely. And this perspective, it directly challenges the Marxist idea that the state is just a tool of the capitalist class.
So what does Rothbard say?
He flips the script, argues that the state is actually the source of the ruling class and that it's constantly battling against true private capital, not supporting it.
Whoa, that's a completely different way of looking at it.
Yeah.
And it has major implications for how we understand the relationship between government and business.
It does. And this brings us to another area where Rothbard's analysis can really shake things up, the way states relate to each other on the international stage.
Right, because if we're talking power dynamics, things can get even more intense when you bring multiple states into the picture.
Exactly. Rothbard points out that states have this natural tendency to expand their power, and that often leads to conflict.
War.
Yeah. He argues that in a world of competing states where each one's striving for dominance, war is, well, it's almost inevitable.
It is a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder, how much of the conflict we see is just a result of this constant power struggle between states. And it makes the whole idea of national defense seem a lot more complex than maybe we initially thought.
It does. And Rothbard, he suggests a thought experiment to really examine this. He asks us to consider, which crimes does the state punish most severely?
Okay.
Crimes against individuals or crimes against the state itself?
That's interesting. What's the answer?
Think about it. What are the most serious offenses in any state?
I guess treason probably tops the list.
Yeah.
Espionage, maybe.
Uh-huh.
Tax evasion, crimes where the state itself is the victim.
Exactly. Those crimes against the state itself, they're almost always punished way more harshly than crimes against individuals like, assault or theft.
Yeah. That's something I'd never considered before.
It suggests that the state often prioritizes its own self-preservation over the well-being of its citizens.
So it's not that states never act in the interests of their citizens. It's that they're always operating with their own survival and power in mind.
That's Rothbard's argument. And understanding this can be a real game changer in terms of how we evaluate government actions and policies.
It's like he's peeling back the curtain and showing us the inner workings of the system, which can be a bit unsettling, but also, I think, incredibly empowering.
It is. It's about seeing the world clearly. And that clear-eyed perspective it's especially important when we look at attempts to regulate conflict between states.
Okay.
Things like international law and treaties.
Right, because if war is this constant threat, haven't there been efforts to make the system more civilized, I guess? What does Rothbard say about that?
He's pretty skeptical of those attempts, and for good reason. He points out that unlike law within a state where there's this recognized authority to enforce it, there's no real enforcement mechanism for international law.
So it's more like a set of guidelines that states can choose to follow or ignore, depending on their interests at the moment.
Exactly. It's like a gentleman's agreement, except, well, gentlemen aren't usually in the business of invading each other's territories.
Yeah, that's a good point. What about treaties?
Okay.
Aren't those supposed to be like legally binding agreements?
Rothbard argues that treaties are fundamentally different from contracts, contracts that involve the transfer of property titles.
Right.
The problem is governments don't actually own the territory they govern in the same way that individuals own property.
So a treaty signed by one government, it might not be considered binding by a future government, especially when it comes to things like giving up land.
Exactly. He uses the example of a government that's, forced to cede territory after losing a war. Rothbard says that neither the people nor the lands, they truly belong to the government. So a future government can't really be bound by that agreement.
So the whole notion of the sanctity of treaties, it might be more of a diplomatic facade than a hard and fast rule.
That's essentially what he's saying. He sees it as another way for states to legitimize their actions, to create this illusion of order in a system that's inherently prone to conflict and instability.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, a real deep dive into the nature of the state.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It really is.
But I think it's crucial to understand these dynamics if we really want to navigate the world, effectively, and protect our own freedoms.
So where does Rothbard leave us with all of this?
Okay.
What's his overall perspective on the state's role in history, like the big picture?
Well, he sees history as this ongoing struggle between what he calls social power and state power.
Okay, what's the difference?
Social power, that represents human cooperation, our ability to produce, innovate, create wealth, all the amazing things humans can achieve when they work together voluntarily.
Okay.
State power, on the other hand, is the power of coercion, control.
So it's like a tug of war between the forces of control and the forces of freedom.
You put it that way. Social power, that's the driving force behind innovation, creativity, economic prosperity. It's what allows individuals to cooperate, to create value without the need for coercion.
So things like free markets,
Yeah.
voluntary associations, even things like open source software, those would all be examples of social power in action.
Absolutely. These are systems where individuals come together freely, to achieve common goals without the need for some centralized authority dictating their actions. They represent a powerful counterbalance to the state's tendency towards control and coercion.
That's an empowering perspective.
It is.
It suggests that we're not powerless in the face of the state's power.
Right.
That we can create and participate in systems that operate outside of its control.
Exactly. And Rothbard, he believed that by understanding this dynamic, by recognizing the power of social cooperation, we can start to shift that balance of power away from the state and towards individuals, towards voluntary associations.
So it's not about dismantling the state entirely. It's about recognizing its limitations and fostering the growth of these alternative systems that can provide for our needs and protect our freedoms in ways that the state often fails to do.
That's a good way to put it. And that's where Rothbard's work can be incredibly relevant to our lives today. He's not just offering a critique of the state. He's offering a roadmap for building a freer future, a more prosperous future, a future where power resides with individuals and communities, not with centralized institutions.
That's a message that resonates deeply with me, and I think with a lot of our listeners too. So let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll dive into Rothbard's analysis of war and the idea of limited warfare, which is fascinating.
All right, so picking up where we left off, with Rothbard's examination of war, he argues that, while states often claim to engage in warfare for defensive purposes or to protect their citizens, the reality, well, it's a bit more complicated. He introduces this fascinating concept called limited warfare.
Limited warfare.
Warfare.
That sounds like a bit of an oxymoron. I mean, How can war be limited? Isn't it inherently chaotic and destructive?
Yeah, that's the common perception, but historically, there have been these attempts to kind of, impose some rules on warfare. Oh. The idea is to confine the violence to the warring states themselves, spare the civilians, minimize collateral damage. It's like saying, okay, we're going to have this duel, but let's keep it civilized and avoid hurting the bystanders.
So like a gentlemanly duel with tanks and missiles instead of pistols at dawn.
Yeah, you could say that, but Rothbard argues that this ideal of limited warfare, it rarely reflects reality.
Why is that? What makes it so difficult to keep war limited?
Well, think about it. If the state's primary goal is self-preservation and war is seen as a threat to its survival, then it's going to be very, very difficult to restrain the use of force, it becomes a matter of survival. And when survival's at stake, well, all bets are off.
So the very nature of the state, with its drive for self-preservation, it makes it almost impossible to contain the violence of war once it breaks out.
Exactly. The idea of a civilized war, where everyone plays by the rules and minimizes harm to non-combatants, it's a noble idea,
Yeah.
but it often clashes with the brutal realities of power politics. Rothbard argues that as wars escalate, they tend to morph into total war, where the distinction between combatants and civilians it blurs, and the entire society becomes a target.
That's a sobering thought. It raises some uncomfortable questions about the way we justify and conduct war.
It does. Rothbard's challenging us to look beyond the rhetoric, to examine the underlying motivations, the dynamics at play. He wants us to understand that war isn't just some unfortunate accident that happens from time to time. It's often a direct consequence of the state's inherent drive for power and expansion.
Okay, so if war is almost inevitable in this world of competing states, and limiting warfare is often more of an ideal than a reality, then where does that leave us? I mean, how do we navigate this complex and dangerous landscape?
That's where things get really interesting, and where Rothbard's analysis can be so valuable. He suggests that we shift our focus from trying to control or limit the state to understanding its fundamental nature and developing strategies to kind of counter its inherent tendencies.
So instead of hoping the state will somehow become less power hungry, less prone to violence, we need to focus on creating systems that can resist those tendencies.
Exactly. And a big part of that is understanding the relationship between state power and what he calls social power.
Okay.
Which is the power of human cooperation and voluntary exchange. He sees history as this constant back and forth between these two forces.
So it's like this tug of war between the forces of control and the forces of freedom.
You could put it that way. Social power is the driving force behind innovation, creativity, and economic prosperity. It's what allows individuals to cooperate, to create value without the need for coercion.
So things like free markets,
Yeah.
voluntary associations, even things like open source software. Those would all be examples of social power in action.
Absolutely. These are all systems where individuals come together freely, to achieve common goals without the need for some centralized authority dictating their actions.
Mhm.
They represent a powerful counterbalance to the state's tendency towards control and coercion.
It's a really empowering perspective.
Yeah.
It suggests that we're not powerless in the face of the state's power, that we have this capacity to create and participate in systems that operate outside its control.
Exactly. And Rothbard believed that by understanding this dynamic, by recognizing the power of social cooperation, we can start to shift the balance of power away from the state and towards individuals, towards voluntary associations.
So it's not about dismantling the state entirely. It's about recognizing its limitations and fostering the growth of these alternative systems that can provide for our needs and protect our freedoms in ways that the state often fails to do.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that's where Rothbard's work can be so relevant to our lives today. He's not just offering a critique of the state. He's offering this roadmap for building a freer future, a more prosperous future, a future where power resides with individuals and communities, not with centralized institutions.
It's a message that really resonates with me, and I think it will with many of our listeners as well.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up our exploration of Rothbard's Anatomy of the State, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will carry with them?
Well, I think that the most important takeaway is that we need to view the state not as this benevolent entity that always acts in our best interests, but as a complex institution with its own inherent tendencies, its own motivations. Rothbard's encouraging us to be skeptical of state power, to question the narratives it promotes, and to recognize its potential for overreach and abuse.
So it's about being, informed citizens, not passive subjects.
Right.
We need to be aware of the ways the state seeks to expand its control and develop strategies to resist those encroachments on our freedoms.
Exactly. And a big part of that is recognizing the power of social cooperation,
Yeah.
the ability of individuals to create and sustain systems that operate outside of the state's control. Rothbard's work, it reminds us that we're not powerless in the face of the state, that we have the capacity to build a freer future, a more prosperous future, but only if we understand the dynamics at play and act accordingly.
That's a powerful message to end on, and I think it's a message that will resonate with anyone who values individual liberty and wants to create a world where power resides with the people, not with the state. It really is,
Yeah.
and it makes you realize that the international system, it's a lot more volatile, a lot more uncertain than we often like to admit.
Yeah, it certainly is. And this kind of brings us back to Rothbard's central argument, The state, with its inherent drive for power, for self-preservation, it'll always prioritize its own interests, even if that means going against, its prior commitments or violating international norms.
So we can't really rely on the state then to create a truly peaceful or just world order.
That's the implication, and it might sound pessimistic, but I think it's actually quite empowering because once we recognize the limitations of these state-centric solutions, we can start to explore, well, alternative approaches to building a more peaceful and prosperous world.
And this is where that concept of social power comes back in, right?
Yeah.
The idea that genuine peace, genuine cooperation, they're more likely to emerge from the bottom up,
Right.
from individuals, from voluntary associations, rather than these top-down state-driven initiatives.
Exactly. Rothbard, he believed that real progress, it comes from the actions of individuals, entrepreneurs, artists, inventors, everyday people who are creating, connecting, building things together without relying on the state's, permission or control.
So it's about fostering those networks of cooperation, of exchange, those spaces where individuals can interact freely and peacefully without the interference of the state or the threat of violence.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's a message that really resonates today, where we're seeing all these decentralized movements, technologies that are challenging those traditional power structures,
Yeah.
creating new possibilities for human interaction, for cooperation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Rothbard's The Anatomy of the State, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with, that nugget of wisdom you hope will stick with them?
I think the most important message is this: don't blindly trust in the state. Don't assume that it always has your best interests at heart. Be skeptical. Question the narratives you're being told, and always think critically about how power operates in society. But at the same time, don't despair. Remember the power of human cooperation, the potential for individuals to create positive change, and never underestimate your own ability to make a difference in the world.
That's a great note to end on. Be informed, be engaged, and never give up on the pursuit of a freer and more just world.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the anatomy of the state. We hope it's given you some new insights, a fresh perspective on the role of the state in our lives. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.